From Washington, Crossfire. On the left, Mike Kinsley. On the right, Pat Buchanan. Tonight, the real target.
Good evening. Welcome to Crossfire. Tonight's question is the obvious one. If the reports are correct, if Iraq has decided to retreat immediately, completely, unconditionally from Kuwait, does the war stop? Or is that now too little too late? Must the Allies keep fighting, perhaps all the way to Baghdad, to stop Saddam Hussein for good? Okay. Pat?
General Haig, let me put that question to you. If the Iraqis are willing to get out of Kuwait unconditionally, march all their forces out, should the United States accept that now, or should we go all the way to Baghdad and overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime?
Well, Pat, certainly not accept what we've had thus far over Baghdad radio or indirectly from the Soviet Union. You know, there's a distorted logic at work today. Those that are insisting that we stick by the UN resolution are forgetting that that UN resolution was designed to get peace and to have a peaceful solution. Now we're in combat. Lives have been lost and atrocities have been committed, more atrocities by Saddam Hussein. Our best bet is to destroy everything he has in the field, to cut off what he has in Kuwait and destroy that, or let them leave that and surrender.
All right, General Haig, let me follow up. If it is necessary, after he gets out of Kuwait and takes his army into Iraq, in order to drive him from power to go to Baghdad, should we consider it, should we do it, or not? Rule it out.
Well, Pat, I don't think we should make that decision yet. What we should not do is say what we will not do. And we should continue to apply military pressure with the kind of professionalism and violence that is being applied in the last 40 hours.
All right, Ambassador Akins, your answer to the question.
Well, I think that as soon as he leaves Kuwait, and obviously he's going to leave Kuwait fairly soon, one way or the other, it's going to be very difficult for him, however, to withdraw the troops as long as he's being bombarded, as long as they are being bombarded. After Kuwait is liberated, I think that the United Nations objective has been accomplished. Kuwait has been liberated, and then we can wait for the Iraqis themselves to take care of Saddam Hussein, and by God, they will.
And so we should stop right in the field. What do you think, Mr. Luttwak?
Well, I think this reasoning is unexceptionable, but the immediate situation, unfortunately, has its own brutal logic. The orders, if the Iraqi troops in Kuwait obey the orders to retreat in organized fashion, which is with their weapons, the thin U.S. column advanced behind Kuwait would be facing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis bearing down on them. They would have no choice but to call in for the maximum possible air support, otherwise there could be a disaster in terms of forces overrun. Hence, if the troops in Kuwait are obeying Saddam Hussein, probably right now the heaviest and most
what would you recommend the United States do right now to avoid some kind of massacre of Iraqi troops who are getting up and walking out?
The United States cannot do anything anymore. This is the difference. The ground war is a commitment. You're in. At that point, the only person who can avoid the massacre would be Saddam Hussein, to countermand these orders and to say, no, ceasefire first, leave weapons second, then return. If he doesn't have a ceasefire before the retreat, the retreat becomes an advance as far as the forces in the path are concerned.
Well, now, General Haig, would you give him a ceasefire, or would you say, no, keep on fighting even so?
Well, the worst thing we can do, Michael, is to give him a ceasefire. That gives him a delay and enables him to move his forces back in organized fashion with all of the equipment, position them just north of the border, and the whole threat will continue to exist, although substantially diminished.
Well, General,
and I don't think we should accept that.
If you won't give him a ceasefire, and if you're not willing to let him retreat out of Kuwait, are you saying that American airplanes should bomb retreating Kuwaiti soldiers and kill them by the thousands? Iraqi soldiers, even while they're retreating?
Michael, if they are retreating or marching backwards or forwards or sideways with their equipment, and that equipment is still deadly, then it should be engaged, and I am confident that that will happen. But the diplomatic end of this thing is still extremely fuzzy and without credibility, and we've got to continue to march.
Sure, but we're assuming, just to clarify our thinking here, that this is going to be for real. Now, let me ask you, Mr. Ambassador, it's very fine to say the UN resolution is why we're fighting, but the truth is that the American forces are the ones doing all the fighting.
Right.
And Americans overwhelmingly, by about 3-1, say they are not satisfied at this point, having invested money and blood in getting Iraq out of Kuwait, that they want 77% said that we should keep on fighting until the military capability of Iraq is destroyed. 75% we should keep on fighting until Saddam Hussein is removed from power. That's a pretty overwhelming consensus of Americans. Are they wrong?
It sure is, and I think that they are wrong, because I don't think they've considered the consequences of what they're talking about. We move into northern Iraq. If we move into Baghdad, that means we have to go through Karbala and Najaf and Kufa, the holy sites of Shia Islam. And we will turn not only the Iraqis against us, we'll turn an awful lot of other people against us as well. If we're going to talk about destroying Saddam Hussein, this is fine. But nobody in the world would disagree with that, including the overwhelming majority of the Iraqis. But we're not destroying Saddam Hussein, we're destroying the infrastructure of Iraq. And when the war is over, then we're going to have to face something entirely different in the Middle East, not only in Iraq, but in every other country of the area.
Mr. Luttwak, let me ask you. The backbone of Saddam Hussein's military power and his strength, apparently, in the country is said to be still the Republican Guard, which still has vital assets, and I guess they're in southern Iraq right now. Is it your view the United States, despite what we're hearing, should continue and go engage and, in effect, defeat and rout those forces in order to remove the last pillar of his strength?
Well, the brute mechanics of the situation of forcing ravenous hawks and the most weak-kneed doves to be in the same position. Military logic is driving the situation. At this point, Iraqi forces with arms that are moving are thereby endangering American forces. Even though the advance has been victorious, you still have a thin line of advance. It's a thin, narrow column. Hence, any Iraqi forces in arms that are now moving must be bombed very heavily. Otherwise, they could suddenly change and start inflicting very serious casualties on U.S. forces. And the same goes for the broader questions raised by Ambassador Akins.
But what I'm asking you here is, at what point do we go for a ceasefire, or do we ignore the idea of a ceasefire and finish off, defeat, and disarm all of his forces in that great bag in southern Iraq and Kuwait, and stop there and then go forward, or what?
As soon as Saddam Hussein declares that he wants a ceasefire and is willing to implement all UN resolutions unconditionally, as written, at that point, and if the Soviet Union conveys that to the United States, and if he says it clearly and explicitly and not while issuing contradictory orders to his troops, then I believe the United States has to accept it. There's no choice in the matter. Otherwise, the United States cannot collide with the Soviet Union if Gorbachev says, this is clear, this is definite.
But as Al Haig has said, there is a dynamic to the battlefield. Americans who would have easily settled before the war for getting him out of Kuwait, now, according to this poll and other polls and statements to congressmen, want this guy finished off. Now, General Haig, I mean, what should be our optimal war aims, those for which we are still willing to fight and to take casualties?
Well, first, Pat, recall that President Bush put forth his own proposals here last week. They were ignored. They're still on the table, and they certainly make certain sense, providing, as Ed has correctly pointed out, the military situation permits a logical conclusion along those lines. The worst thing we can do is to constantly say what we won't do. This fellow has ignored everything up until now. Now that he's been licked on the battlefield, he's trying to preserve what he has left, and we should minimize his opportunity to do that. At the same time, we are on record. The president's on record. It's up to Iraq to come forth directly to the United States and accept those conditions, and if they do, then we might consider, in the light of the existing military situation, whether or not a ceasefire can be imposed.
Okay, we're going to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to ask all three gentlemen how long they think the war will continue and how long they think it will be before Saddam Hussein is out of power.
We will prevail. Kuwait will soon be free, and America's men and women in uniform will return home to the thanks and respect of a grateful nation.
Welcome back. We're talking about these reports out of Baghdad that are unverified that Saddam Hussein is ordering his army to get up and to march out of Kuwait unconditionally. As I said, they're unverified right now. We're talking about the possibility that they are true. Our guests are General Alexander Haig. He's a former Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan and early in the administration. Ed Luttwak, who's a military analyst with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And James Akins, who is a former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia in the Nixon and Ford administrations. Ambassador Akins, I want to ask you, we have seen across the Arab world demonstrations, some riots, disorders, all manner of support, it seems, for Saddam Hussein and for Iraq among the Arab peoples. How seriously should we take this? And the second question is related to it. How long can the Saudi regime and the Emir of Kuwait stay in power if the Americans pull out of the region?
Well, we have to take the demonstrations extremely seriously. We just had them in Cairo today. This is part of the alliance. We've had them in Morocco, also part of the alliance. And it's going to get much worse. It's not really, however, a defense of Saddam Hussein. I think most Arabs understand that Saddam is a monster and is a dictator, and it's nobody they'd want to have as their own leader. But they're demonstrating basically against the American presence and against an attack, a destructive attack on an Arab country. This is what we have to take seriously. And this is what we're going to be living with for a long time.
Is it a permanent hostility to the United States, or after we win this dramatic victory, will it subside?
We're not going to win a victory. Saddam is going to be defeated. Iraq is going to be crushed. But you cannot equate that with an American victory. It's going to be a military victory. But is it going to be a victory for us? This is going to be a case where everybody loses. And the United States is going to be one of the main losers. The people are comparing us.
Do you agree with that?
People are comparing us already to the Mongols.
We have a cultural collision here. I think we must remain within the immediacy of the military decisions and the diplomatic decisions, because the cultural collision between Islam and the West is not something anybody can do anything about. This attack is not only an attack on Iraq, it's an attack on a powerful Islamic country. Can't avoid that. If you have Islamic countries which are very heavily armed and which are very aggressive, they're going to be hit and they're going to be crushed. And then this collision is just inevitable. I think it's both true what the ambassador said and in a way irrelevant, because we can't help it.
Well, let me take the ambassador's point to General Haig. Al Haig, we are hearing here from Ambassador Akins that the United States, even when it's winning this great military victory, may be suffering a larger defeat in the Arab and Islamic world. Do you take that point?
I take that point, and it's not without very important underpinnings. On the other hand, let me tell you this, Pat, and the ambassador, that where we had failed, if we had failed, then the contempt for the United States would be unanimous and overwhelming. So all of these naysayers, and I put the ambassador in that group tonight, have got to balance what the costs of bringing about a just outcome. Now, the other thing that you raised, and that's another one of the naysayers' thesis, and that is that Kuwait somehow was a repressive regime and we have to deal with the democratization of that country. The facts are Kuwait was probably the most progressive of all of the Arab states. And the facts were that it was ruled by a minority. And that says something for the policies they pursued over the years. I think we have to be very careful of the armchair boys who have been giving President Bush hell from day one. They've been fighting a delaying action in every line. Thank God our president was clear-headed and did what was right.
All right, let's follow around on a related question.
Answer that.
Well, let me ask the ambassador a related question. Secretary Cheney repeated yesterday that there is no intention of having American troops there permanently in the Middle East. And the Saudis even made a sign on the dotted line that we wouldn't stay when this is over. Dr. Brzezinski has said on this program, on the other hand, that when this thing is over, we're going to have to be there for the reasons you were suggesting, that it's going to be very unstable. Are American troops in the Mideast permanently, or at least for the foreseeable future?
Cheney has said different things, if you recall. He's talked various times of our being there for 10 years or an indefinite period. Of course we're going to be there for a long time. We're going to have to be. After Iraq is destroyed, and it's going to be destroyed, who's going to be the superpower in the area? Saudi Arabia? Kuwait? Of course not. It's going to be Iran.
Ed Luttwak, are American troops going to be there for years?
The destruction of Iraq leaves Iran as the strongest local power. Hence, it has to be counterbalanced. But you don't need 500,000 troops for that. It could be something limited and confined, like a Marine division in Kuwait.
The question that Al Haig is putting to both you gentlemen is, was this worth doing then?
This war?
Yeah.
No. My view, of course, Pache and General Haig, is that the war wasn't necessary in the first place. The sanctions were working. We should have showed patience. Iraq had one export only. It had no money. People don't break sanctions because they love Saddam's big blue eyes. They break them because they're paid, and he had no money.
Was the war worth it, Ed Luttwak?
I think no unavoidable situations. In the end, you have to have a ground war because of the Soviet initiatives. You have to have an air war because an ultimatum was set. And Al Haig is right. However terrible victory may be, defeat would have been much worse.
Okay, we don't even have to ask General Haig whether he thinks this was worthwhile. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I am going to ask Ed Luttwak, however, was he wrong in all these months when he was telling us, for heaven's sake, avoid a land war?
Our strategy to go after this army is very, very simple. First, we're going to cut it off, and then we're going to kill it.
People in this debate, hawks and doves alike, including me, I have to admit, with your argument that whatever we do, we should avoid a land war and keep the air war going indefinitely. Did you mislead us?
Well, I was trying to mislead you because I was trying to prolong the air war as long as possible, resist the temptation to finish with it quickly by ground. Every passing day that the air war continued, the Iraqi army was weakened further.
But you're weaseling. Was George Bush wrong to start the ground war last week when he finally did?
When he finally did, he had no choice because the Soviet initiative that came in completely muddled the cards, created enormous confusion. At that point, he had to issue the ultimatum, and you couldn't
but it's going extremely well.
Indeed, it's going extremely well because the bombing was so heavy. The bombing was so heavy.
Where are all these awful consequences?
The original concept, the original scheme of things would have been quick bombing, couple of days, like in regular wars, and then forward.
General Haig, let me give me a final question to you. General Haig, do you think that if Saddam Hussein survives or his Ba'ath Party remains in control of Iraq, that Hosni Mubarak, president of Egypt, and the King Saud and the Emir of Kuwait can really get a peaceful night's sleep if they're still in power?
Yes, of course they can, Pat. The question is, what do we do in the final hours here? I don't believe a major U.S. presence will be necessary. We've had a presence for 40 years in the region. We'll need it for another 40 years, but not an overwhelming presence. And the moderate Arab regimes who've stood up to this man are going to be now capable, with our help, of shaping its future.
Okay, thank you very much, Al Haig in New York. Thanks, Ed Luttwak, for coming in at the last minute, and thank you, Ambassador Akins. Pat Buchanan and I will be back in a moment.
Michael, the White House is saying the war goes on, quote from Marlin Fitzwater. My guess is there's two questions left. One is, will the United States continue and go in and engage the Republican Guard in Iraq itself? And secondly, will they make the decision to go up to Baghdad if they feel that's necessary to get rid of him, Saddam Hussein?
There's a preliminary question, which is, does Saddam Hussein really mean it this time? And it's interesting, I thought that even General Haig said that if he really means it, if he's really prepared to meet the terms of the UN resolution, even General Haig said, we're not going to go after him. And I think that probably is correct.
Well, I mean, Ed Luttwak raises a good point. If all these people start marching toward the borders with their weapons and trucks and some of their armor, it's liable to be a massacre.
Yeah, but he, apparently, I'm no expert, if they want to give up, there is still a way they can do it without being slaughtered. At least I hope that's the case. From the left, I'm Mike Kinsley. Good night for Crossfire.
From the right, Pat Buchanan. Join us tomorrow night for another edition of Crossfire.